The hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the dull thud of a jukebox in the background. Just another Saturday afternoon at the bar. For most, it was a place of escape, of routine, of numbness disguised as relaxation. For William Bill Harlow, it was something else entirely. A quiet ritual, the echo of a life once full. At 85, his body bore the weight of wars fought in silence, Korea, Panama, and of love lost when his wife passed. But his soul, forged in the crucible of duty and sacrifice, remained steady. Every weekend, he came not for the drinks, but to wipe down the old tables he had once polished as the bar's original owner, a private way of preserving meaning in a world that had grown louder, faster, more indifferent. That day, he noticed a spill spreading across one of the corner tables. No fanfare, no hesitation, just muscle memory as he reached into his back pocket for the same cloth he'd carried for decades. The same one he'd used when he closed the bar during storms or polished glasses before the Marines came in after a funeral. But today, the cloth wasn't met with appreciation. It was met with contempt. "This table's mine. Can't you see you're too old for this?" a voice growled. The biker was large, mid-30s, face pockmarked with arrogance and adrenaline. His leather vest screamed aggression more than affiliation. Before anyone could respond, before disbelief could catch up to reaction, the man's fist arced through the air and landed squarely on Bill's face. There was no cinematic crash, no heroic soundtrack, just a sickening, intimate sound of flesh meeting bone, followed by silence so loud it suffocated the room. Blood trickled down the side of Bill's cheek like an accusation against everyone watching. The world held its breath. And then nothing. The bartender, once a teenager Bill had taught how to pour a proper draft, turned away and began polishing glasses he had already cleaned. A regular at the far end shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Even the manager, a kid Bill had once hired as a dishwasher, peeked out from the back office only to disappear again. The message was clear. Silence was easier than justice. And fear, it seemed, had bought every drink in the room. Bill didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse or retaliate. That was not his way. Instead, he gently braced himself against the bar, fingers shaking not from fear, but from age and memory. He reached for his phone, opened it with deliberate care, and dialed a single number, one his hands had memorized, not just his mind. No theatrics, no threat. He sat down, blood soaking into the collar of his shirt, and held the phone to his ear. What had just occurred wasn't merely an act of violence. It was a slap in the face of human decency. It was the world choosing convenience over courage. And while it might have appeared that Bill was calling for help because he was weak, the truth was the opposite. He was calling not to protect himself, but to call the world to account. He was a man who had stood between chaos and peace when bullets flew. But today, the betrayal came not from enemies, but from neighbors. And for the first time, the battle wasn't on a foreign shore. It was in the hearts of people too afraid to stand for what was right. He sat quietly, hand pressed to his wound, eyes unfocused not because of pain, but because he was searching for something deeper, something that had once defined this country, but was now slipping away like the last notes of a forgotten anthem: honor. The call rang only once before it was answered. A single chime, sharp and immediate, like a rifle shot in a silent forest. On the other end of the line, Colonel Richard Harlow was seated at Fort Bragg, deep in operational plans, his mind consumed by the logistics of deployment, rotations, and risk assessments. But the moment he saw the name on his phone, all of it, every strategy, every tactical forecast evaporated. "Dad," he answered, already standing. Bill's voice, though calm, carried an undertone Richard hadn't heard in years. Not fear, his father didn't fear, but something else, something far more jarring: resignation. "There's been a situation at Ali's," he said simply. "Nothing serious." But Richard knew better. His father never called during work hours, never interrupted duty, and more importantly, never downplayed pain unless he was protecting someone. Richard's breath sharpened. His eyes locked onto a framed photo of his father in uniform, surrounded by young Marines decades ago. "I'll be there soon," he said, voice clipped with urgency. Back at the bar, Bill ended the call, his fingers trembling slightly, not from the blow he'd received, but from the choice he had made. It wasn't weakness that compelled him to call his son. It was something far more uncomfortable. The realization that age, sacrifice, and quiet service had lost their meaning to the world around him. He wasn't asking for rescue. He was asking for recognition, not of himself, but of something this room had forgotten, the invisible thread of honor that once stitched strangers into citizens. The biker, unaware of the weight of the domino he had just knocked loose, loomed nearby, grinning with the hollow confidence of someone used to winning cheap battles. "Who'd you call, Grandpa?" "The retirement home," he sneered. Bill didn't answer. He simply pressed his blood-stained handkerchief a little tighter to his cheek, his eyes far away, not fixed on the thug before him, but on memories deeper than this bar could ever understand, of brothers who never came home, of nights spent holding the line for people who would never know his name. He could have retaliated. Once he would have. But time changes how we fight. Now, Bill's strength was in knowing which battles were his and which needed to be witnessed. 30 minutes later, the low, unmistakable growl of military engines rumbled down the street like thunder before a storm. 3 armored vehicles, polished but scarred from real operations, came to a stop in front of the bar. A flag-bearing Humvee parked last, a silent declaration of something larger than just personnel, of purpose. Inside the bar, laughter died mid-breath. Jokes hung in the air like smoke, too heavy to dissipate. The biker froze mid-sip. Conversations dissolved into awkward silence. Everyone felt it, that shift in pressure, like the air before lightning strikes. The moment when everyone, regardless of their ignorance or guilt, understands that a line has been crossed, and that someone was coming to redraw it. Colonel Richard Harlow stepped into the room not with noise, but with certainty.
He didn't yell.
He didn't posture. He simply looked around the room, his eyes taking in every face, every twitch of shame, every heartbeat of cowardice. "Who struck First Sergeant William Harlow?" he asked. The room responded with silence, the coward's preferred language. This wasn't a movie. No punches would be returned. No chairs would be thrown. Richard didn't come with violence. He came with clarity, the kind that wakes people up, not with tears but with truth. A father had been hurt, not because he was old, but because the world had grown blind to the quiet valor that once held it steady. And a son had come, not for revenge, but to remind everyone what it meant to care about something enough to answer the call. The bar was thick with smoke and silence, but the silence wasn't empty, it was heavy, laden with a weight far greater than the punch that had landed on Bill's cheek. It was the silence of witnesses who chose to look away, the kind that doesn't just ignore injustice, but makes it possible. Every glance avoided, every sip taken as if nothing had happened, became a thread in a web of complicity. The patrons weren't just bystanders. They were the quiet enablers of a violence that no longer shocked, but had settled into routine. Bill sat against the weathered wood of the bench outside, his blood mixing with the grit of the sidewalk, his breath steady despite the stinging pain. He wasn't just an old man hurt by a biker's fist. He was a symbol, a living testament to a generation that had given everything and now found itself erased by apathy. Inside, the bikers rumbled on, laughing too loudly, their bravado a thin veneer over the growing unease. The regulars, once friendly faces, now shrank into themselves, afraid to break the fragile peace of denial. "Shouldn't someone help him?" a young server whispered, voice trembling with a mix of fear and guilt. "Not worth it," came the cold reply. This moment, so ordinary on the surface, echoed a deeper truth Bill had fought against all his life, the corrosive power of silence. In war, the enemy is clear, and battles are fought openly, with honor and clarity. But in civilian life, the enemy often wears the mask of indifference, and the battlefield is hidden in everyday choices. To watch a man who once stood in the crucible of combat be reduced to silence, to endure humiliation alone, was a betrayal far worse than any punch. Bill's decision to call his son was not an admission of defeat, It was a call to action against this silence. He understood that true strength lies not in fighting every battle oneself, but in knowing when to summon others who carry the weight and will to restore balance. This wasn't just about him. It was about what the silence said about a society that no longer values sacrifice or respect. As the minutes ticked by, the stillness outside the bar grew heavier with anticipation. The invisible line had been crossed, and now the consequences would follow, not through random violence or chaotic revenge, but through deliberate reckoning. The silence that once protected the aggressor was about to be shattered, not with noise, but with the undeniable presence of honor returned. In this quiet moment, Bill was neither victim nor hero. He was a mirror held up to a world that had forgotten the cost of its complacency, a reminder that silence is never neutral, but a choice. And some choices demand a reckoning. 30 minutes, the span of time that stretched like a fragile thread between helplessness and resolve, between silence and reckoning. It was long enough for doubt to creep in, for the sting of betrayal to settle deep, but short enough to hold onto the fragile hope that justice still mattered. Outside the bar, the street was quiet, save for the distant rumble that grew steadily louder, an ominous, purposeful sound that shattered the numbness lingering in the air. Then came the roar. Engines echoed like thunderclaps, armored vehicles rolling in with the weight of authority and history behind them. The arrival was not merely a show of force, but a statement, a resurrection of values that had been battered but never extinguished. The flag-bearing Humvee led the procession, a solemn emblem of duty and sacrifice, painting a stark contrast against the tired neon lights flickering inside the bar. Inside, the bikers who had been so brazen minutes before now froze. The laughter that had filled the air died instantly, replaced by a thick tension, palpable and electric. The bar's usual hum of conversations faded into a suffocating silence. Eyes darted nervously, bravado dissolving as the gravity of the moment sunk in. The regular patrons, who had turned their faces away moments earlier, now stared, the shame of their inaction mirrored in their downcast eyes. Richard Harlow stepped out first, his presence commanding without the need for raised voices or aggressive posturing. Years of leadership, of making impossible decisions under fire, shaped every measured step he took. The soldiers behind him were shadows of discipline and precision, moving with a calm readiness that spoke louder than any weapon drawn. They weren't there to escalate violence. They were there to restore order, to reclaim a respect that had been stolen. Richard's gaze swept across the room, piercing through the smoke and discomfort until it landed on the bar manager. "Who struck First Sergeant William Harlow?" His voice cut through the silence like a blade, demanding an answer that none dared give. The room held its breath, the silence a loud indictment of guilt and fear. The bikers shifted uneasily, their postures betraying a sudden awareness that this was no ordinary confrontation. The security footage was projected onto the wall, a stark, undeniable record of the assault. The images were raw, unfiltered proof that could not be ignored or denied. As the video played, the unspoken truth filled the room, an act of violence against a man who embodied decades of sacrifice, a man who had fought for honor on distant battlefields, had been reduced to a target in a dimly lit bar. This was not just a father-son moment. It was a summons to a community, a challenge to a society that had forgotten the meaning of respect. The military precision with which the team secured the premises was a silent testament to the discipline and values Bill had passed down, not just his son, but to all who understood what it meant to stand for something larger than oneself. Outside, the streetlights flickered over the armored vehicles, guardians standing watch in a city that too often turned a blind eye. Inside, the reckoning had begun, not with fists or rage, but with a deliberate, unyielding assertion of dignity restored. The 30 minutes had passed. The waiting was over, and honor had arrived. Discipline over force. This was the unspoken creed that underpinned every movement, every decision in that charged room. The air was thick with a tension that demanded respect, yet it was not a call to violence, but a quiet assertion of something far deeper: honor. Richard Harlow and his team arrived not as warriors seeking retribution, but as guardians of a code that transcended fists and fury, a code forged in years of sacrifice and tempered by restraint. Inside the bar, the atmosphere shifted palpably. The bikers, once loud and menacing, now shrank under the weight of unyielding discipline. Their bravado cracked, revealing a brittle facade when confronted not with equal aggression but with measured authority. Richard's voice was calm yet commanding, carrying the weight of decades spent commanding troops through chaos and conflict. Each word was deliberate, cutting through the room's uneasy silence like a beacon of clarity. "You struck a man who didn't fight back because he was weak, but because he chose to preserve his dignity," Richard said, his gaze steady and unwavering. "This isn't about who can throw the hardest punch. It's about the respect owed to a man who has carried the burdens of war on his shoulders, who bore the scars of battles we may never understand." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken stories of courage and sacrifice. The soldiers, standing sentinel around the room, embodied the principle that discipline is a far more potent weapon than brute strength. Their presence was a reminder that true power lies in control over one's actions, emotions, and choices. They moved with a quiet efficiency, securing the space not through intimidation but through professionalism, turning the bar from a place of chaos to a sanctuary of order. Richard's team ensured the evidence was preserved, the assault captured in the clear light of security footage. It was a testament to transparency, an insistence that truth cannot be hidden behind smoke and mirrors. The act of documenting was itself an act of respect to Bill, to justice, and to the values that bind a society together. Outside, the community watched, some with admiration, others with quiet reflection. The scene was more than a family's response to violence. It was a lesson to all who bore witness. The message was unmistakable. Honor is not earned through domination or fear, but through restraint and unwavering commitment to what is right. It challenged the bystanders who had turned away, who had let silence become complicity. Richard's gaze softened as he approached his father, still seated with the stoic grace of a man shaped by decades of service. "You didn't call me because you needed protection," he said quietly. "You called because some things are bigger than ourselves." Bill nodded, a faint smile breaking through the weariness. "Discipline over force," he replied. "That's the real strength." The lesson was clear, not just for the bikers or the bar patrons, but for anyone who struggles to balance power with principle. True courage is found not in escalating violence, but in knowing when to hold back, when to choose honor over humiliation. It is a strength that demands patience and wisdom, a quiet dignity that can restore respect even in the darkest moments. That evening, as the soldiers stood down and the community began to stir with newfound awareness, the bar was transformed. It was no longer just a place of old routines and forgotten respect. It had become a living testament to the power of discipline, the resilience of honor, and the enduring bonds that tie generations of service together. In that space, amid the echoes of a difficult night, a profound truth took root, that the greatest victories are those won with restraint, and that the legacy of honor endures far beyond the battlefield. The aftermath of that turbulent evening carried a weight far heavier than bruises or shattered illusions. It was a moment where dignity, long trampled under the careless boots of indifference, was finally lifted back into the light. Bill Harlow, an 85-year-old veteran whose hands had once steadied the lives of men in the chaos of war, sat quietly on the wooden bench outside the bar. Blood still marked his cheek, a raw testament to the assault, but his posture was unbroken, steadfast as the principles he lived by. Around him, the hum of the city continued, oblivious to the storm that had just passed, yet within the walls of that small community, a ripple of awakening began to spread. The arrival of Colonel Richard Harlow and his Special Forces team had not only restored honor to a man wronged, it had ignited a spark in the hearts of those who had silently witnessed injustice and turned away. This was more than a personal family matter. It became a reflection of a fractured society, a call to conscience that demanded acknowledgement. As Richard embraced his father, the gesture spoke volumes. Respect earned through decades of sacrifice was not merely a family legacy, but a communal debt. Inside the bar, the atmosphere shifted palpably. Patrons who had once averted their eyes now greeted Bill with nods of respect, some even stepping forward to apologize quietly for their earlier silence. The bar itself, once just a backdrop to this unfortunate altercation, transformed into a living monument to resilience and redemption. The old routine of Bill cleaning tables resumed, but now every movement was met with a newfound reverence, as if the simple act carried the weight of history and honor. Beyond the bar's walls, the incident reverberated through the community like a clarion call. Local schools invited veterans to speak, bridging generations with stories of courage and sacrifice that had long been overshadowed by the noise of everyday life. A program was established to connect younger veterans with their elders, creating a network of support and understanding that wove strength into the fabric of the town. Even some of the bikers returned, not with defiance, but with a desire to listen, to hear firsthand the stories that shaped a man they had once underestimated. Bill, despite the pain and humiliation he endured, found a renewed purpose. His Saturday visits became more than a ritual. They were a testament to the enduring power of dignity. The community's awakening was not merely about righting a wrong, but about reclaiming a collective identity rooted in respect and empathy. Children who once saw only the harsh silhouette of an old man now saw a hero, a living testament to courage both on and off the battlefield. In quiet moments at home, Richard and Bill shared reflections on what had transpired, not just the violence, but the profound lessons beneath it. "You restored more than my honor," Bill said softly. "You reminded us all what it means to stand for something." Richard nodded, understanding that their fight was never just against an assailant, but against the apathy that let such acts go unchallenged. The incident left an indelible mark, a story passed between neighbors, a lesson etched into the heart of a community. It reminded them that dignity is not given lightly nor taken for granted. It must be fiercely protected, especially for those who have given everything for others. And as the sun set on that chapter, the community stood a little taller, awakened from its slumber, ready to face the world with a renewed sense of justice and honor. In the end, it was not just Bill Harlow's dignity that was restored. It was the soul of a community, awakened and alive, forever changed by the courage of one man and the unwavering love of a son. The legacy of that evening stretched far beyond the bruised skin and fading memories. It became a beacon, a radiant thread woven into the fabric of a community that had once stood silently by. Bill Harlow, with his weathered hands and steady gaze, was no longer just an elderly veteran quietly cleaning tables on a Saturday. He had become a living testament to resilience, sacrifice, and the unspoken bonds that tie generations of service together. The scars he bore, both visible and invisible, were reminders not only of wars fought overseas, but of battles waged within the hearts of those who carry the weight of honor. In the weeks that followed, the bar, once a place of casual routine, transformed into a sanctuary of respect and remembrance. A new sign hung proudly above the entrance, crafted by Bill himself, its letters carved deep with the steady hand of a man who had seen too much to settle for anything less than dignity. Patrons who had ignored or dismissed the elderly man now greeted him with nods and quiet words of gratitude, their eyes reflecting a newfound understanding of what it truly means to stand tall in the face of adversity. The story of that day spread quickly, becoming a catalyst for change that reached beyond the bar's walls. Local schools invited veterans to speak, their voices weaving history and personal sacrifice into lessons that transcended textbooks. The community forged connections between young and old, veterans and civilians, building bridges where silence and ignorance once prevailed. These gatherings were more than ceremonies. They were healing spaces, where shared stories fostered empathy and rekindled a collective conscience. Even those who had once challenged Bill's presence, the bikers, found themselves drawn into this transformation. Some returned, humbled and curious, seeking not confrontation but conversation. They listened to tales of valor and loss, discovering in Bill a man shaped by hardship but defined by unwavering principles. This shift from hostility to respect symbolized a broader awakening, a reminder that beneath rough exteriors and hardened attitudes lie hearts capable of change. At home, Bill and Richard reflected often on the ripple effect of that night. Their bond, forged in blood and shared values, had sparked something far greater than personal vindication. "This is the legacy we leave," Richard said quietly. "Not just medals or stories, but a renewed spirit that challenges indifference and calls for honor." Bill nodded, the lines on his face deepening with a soft smile. "It's about lighting a path for those who come after us," he said. "So they never have to fight alone." The incident became more than an isolated event. It evolved into a narrative of hope and accountability. It taught that respect is not a given. It is earned and fiercely protected. It showed that the courage to stand up, even when battered and weary, inspires others to do the same. Most importantly, it reminded everyone that the bonds between generations, woven through sacrifice, love, and honor, are the strongest shields against the erosion of humanity. And so, the legacy of Bill Harlow endures, not only in the wooden sign above a small-town bar or in the smiles of children who now know the meaning of true courage, but in the very heart of a community awakened. A legacy that shines brightly, a beacon for all who believe that honor is timeless and that the light of one man's dignity can illuminate the path for many.